There's all sorts of stuff in there, the destruction of evidence, concealment of evidence, hacking voicemail, hacking emails, all sorts of bad behaviour. That's abusing the power of the press.
We were commissioned by several newspapers, and there's a lot more to come out.
It isn't just a historical issue. Literally, nothing has changed.
At their best, British newspapers play a vital role in holding the powerful to account. But over the last 2 decades, parts of the press have been exposed as breaking the law, covering up criminal behaviour, and failing to meet ethical standards. This can't be good for journalism. But how is it affecting the public and those most at risk of marginalisation and abuse? And does it even matter when print circulations are so low? Free and independent reporting is vital, but with freedom comes responsibility. I'm Florence Wildblood, and for this documentary, I will be asking what happens when that responsibility is abused, what the consequences are for the public, and what needs to change. Over the years, the British press has often found itself in the headlines, for both good reasons and bad. The biggest scandal to hit the newspaper industry in living memory is surely the phone hacking scandal, which exploded in 2011. It was revealed that some national newspapers were stealing people's private information and listening in on their voicemails. The targets of phone hacking included people who were in the news because they were victims of crime. The scandal led to the Leveson Inquiry, where dozens of victims spoke about the impact of phone hacking on their lives.
Just before the trial, we'd found out about Millie's phone being hacked. When we were given that information, it was terribly difficult to process it, because what do you do with that information when it's in your mind?
I got my original handwritten copy of my diary out and sat there, and it was lifted in its entirety and put in the newspaper without my knowledge. And I felt totally violated. I'd written these words on thoughts at the most desperate time of my life. And, there was absolutely no respect shown for me as a grieving mother or as a human being, or for my daughter.
I was put in touch with a private investigator previously convicted for unlawful information gathering at the behest of mainstream newspapers, a practice denied at the Leveson Inquiry by newspaper executives. He has asked us to hide his identity. Why is it that you need to be anonymous today?
I would like to protect my identity because of my family and my current business, but that's the only reason.
Can you tell us about the kind of work that you were doing with the newspapers before the Leveson Inquiry?
We were commissioned by several newspapers to do a number of things, anything from tracing individuals to obtaining bank account information, hacking, email hacking, phone tapping. So it was a wide variety of things that we were asked to do.
And can you name the newspapers that you were working with?
Yes, we worked with the News of the World, The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express. I think they were the 4 main ones.
Do you feel like the people who were working at the newspapers were sufficiently punished, sufficiently implicated in the sort of criminal activity and the comeuppance for it, if you like?
No, not at all. I think there are people who have been convicted, or even those that haven't been convicted but brought into the mix, I think have been the scapegoats for the real people that have been involved in this, which are the newspapers and the editors. These people are abhorrent, actually. I think the way that they've dealt with this and the way they've managed to get away with it is terrible. And I hope they're held to account, as they quite rightly should be. I think there's a lot more to come out.
The man I interviewed has also shared his experiences on broadcast media, yet none of the major newspapers have investigated his claims. The press say that they've cleaned up their act since the phone hacking scandal. I asked Nick Davies, the journalist who exposed what was going on, if he believes that culture and practices in the press have improved, and if standards are any better.
So the most shocking single thing that I found was that years after we all thought the Murdoch titles, particularly The Sun, had stopped committing crimes to get information, the evidence strongly suggests they carried on. They carried on committing crimes. And we still don't know if they stopped. So the evidence we've got finishes around the end of 2011. And up to that point, they're still committing crimes. So they may have continued after that date. It's breathtaking, actually, to see them doing it.
And they were committing crimes during the Leveson Inquiry itself?
During the Leveson Inquiry, it's certain that the three Mirror Group titles were doing it, and very strongly suggested by the evidence that The Sun also was still committing crimes. While their senior people are sitting in front of Leveson saying, whoa, we wouldn't do that. We stopped that ages ago. It was really depressing, actually. A press that refuses to write about itself is professionally and intellectually corrupt. Where we've got to now, post-Leveson, is that we have another sham regulator, which is controlled by and populated by the very newspapers whose work it's supposed to be judging. So in Leveson's famous phrase, they're still marking their own homework. And they're not to be trusted. These are organizations that deal in falsehood and distortion, that have a history of criminality, a history of lying about their criminality. Why on earth would we trust them to tell the truth about themselves?
It was troubling to hear all of this. But is it still so important to ensure newspapers are behaving themselves, given falling circulations and changes to the way that we use media? Professor Natalie Fenton is one of the leading experts on the media in Europe and has been studying media and democracy for over 20 years.
The two reasons people say that newspapers have lost their power. One is that not as many newspapers are sold. And that's true. Not as many newspapers are sold, but very many people still read the content of those newspapers because it circulates online. So over 50 million people are reading the content of those newspapers every month. And whether that's on social media, whether it's on an app, whether it's through their own website, people are accessing that news. So if anything, those newspapers are more powerful than they've ever been, regardless of the fact that for decades they've misrepresented issues, they've distorted truths, and they've abused their power. Regardless of that, because they're already established, they have become amplified in a digital age, not diminished. So this is one of my key gripes is you're endlessly going on about holding the powerful to account. You don't do that because actually the press industry on the whole is part of the establishment. They're not the watchdogs of power at all. They're actually in bed with power. So, that's, and worse than that, they are trampling on the powerless. And we see that endlessly in abuses of privacy and the willingness to run roughshod over people's lives, regardless of what the outcomes will be.
I was curious about what Nick said regarding IPSO, the complaints body most newspapers are signed up to. I was surprised to find that its rules and its standards code are actually controlled by another organisation called the Regulatory Funding Company, a group of newspaper executives, and that its standards code is written by newspaper editors. This is clearly a case of newspapers marking their own homework, just like Nick said. I thought about the consequences of this for the press today, and particularly for those most at risk of abuse or inaccuracy. Recently, a UN report accused parts of the British press of inflaming racial hatred. I approached the Centre for Media Monitoring, which monitors anti-Muslim discrimination in the press.
What we currently find in mainstream media, I would say over a decade ago or more, you would have only found on dark corners of the web or on far-right platforms on social media, whereas they have now become really mainstream center stage. And that's not just in tabloids, that's in broadsheets. But the kind of things that we've seen over the years, things like Islam is a threat to the West, Muslim and Islamic values are incompatible with Western liberal democratic values. The religion itself is inherently violent and condones terrorism. And of course, the Muslims equal terrorist. And then obviously one of the big ones is, Islamization, i.e. Muslims are trying to take over Britain in terms of mainstream politics, mainstream media. And we saw during the riots earlier in August, the targets are Muslims and migrants. And a lot of the migrants happen to be Muslim as well.
These people are not welcome here. Say they're welcome, they're not welcome.
I find that the media is very fear-mongering, because that's what attracts attention, right? How much fake news and disinformation there is about immigration.
So much of the media is owned by a very small proportion of people, and they have a very vested interest in in creating divides between people. Everything that's happened recently is shocking and awful and terrible. But also if you go into the news agents on any particular day and you look at the headlines in the newspapers, you're just going to see the demonization of people of color and minoritized identities.
And what is the impact in Muslim communities on the ground of this inaccurate and discriminatory reporting that so clearly isn't being regulated?
I would say the worst kind of impact are hate crimes and physical, verbal abuse and discrimination that Muslims face. So a really problematic article that we found was completely inaccurate, appeared in the Mail on Sunday, and it was written by the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, where she was talking about the so-called grooming gang phenomenon. Now, what she said there went against her own Home Office's studies, which concluded that the majority of people who take part in child sexual exploitation, which is the legal term, are predominantly white men. So it was inaccurate. We complained about it, and the Mail on Sunday had to kind of issue a correction along those lines. But the tendency for people to believe something about Muslims or Islam because that has become the narrative, even though it's based on false tropes and stereotypes. And so if mainstream media is depicting us in a certain way, then that's going to influence public opinion, and therefore that is spread out everywhere, whether it's in the workplace, whether you go for job interviews, whether you're looking for housing, or generally just in your kind of interpersonal relationship.
Islamophobia isn't the only way that discrimination against marginalised communities manifests in the press. I read about a coalition of organisations which had complained about an article in The Telegraph, which made baseless claims about victims of modern slavery. The letter was coordinated by Maya Esselmont, Director of After Exploitation.
There was a really high-profile kind of Telegraph front page that shocked a lot of members of the charity sector. It shocked a lot of survivor leaders at the time, because it claimed that the Modern Slavery Act was being used as a loophole for immigrants. So this Modern Slavery Act protects UK victims as well as non-UK victims, and it also protects survivors who maybe aren't from the UK, but their immigration status is completely fine and secure. So the claim was that because the number of trafficking victims identified was growing, it meant that it is subject to abuse. And that rhetoric was used by government to justify huge cuts to survivor support under the Nationality and Borders Act. So we took a complaint to IPSO, raising that there's no available evidence that the system is being abused by trafficking victims. On top of that, we know that the rise in modern slavery referrals is just as high amongst the UK population as it has been in the non-UK population. So our question is, are UK victims also pretending to be trafficked so they can stay in the UK? It just doesn't make any sense, and there's no available evidence to prove the Telegraph's kind of claims on that. When we went to IPSO, we were joined by a number of charities, we were joined by survivor leaders who shared testimonies about the damage caused by this kind of coverage. And we did actually secure a correction, which I was assured is a really positive thing. Apparently it's quite rare. But unfortunately, that correction was just hidden away, as you'll know, kind of in the bottom of the second page of the newspaper. But that damage had already been done. And I think a lot of people with lived experience who supported with the complaint couldn't understand how that lie could take so much prominence, and it could kind of be on newsstands across the UK, telling people that trafficking victims are lying or trafficking isn't real. they couldn't understand how the correction doesn't fit the crime.
There's clearly an argument that inaccurate reporting about Muslims, victims of modern slavery, and other groups is affecting the public's views and, in the most severe cases, contributing to marginalisation and even abuse. The examples given by Rizwana and Maya weren't criticisms of different faiths or cultures, they were outright falsehoods and inaccuracies. I thought of one of the biggest challenges facing humanity, climate change, how newspapers are covering this topic and whether distortion might affect our responses to it. What is the impact on the public, on policy, on the climate of misinformation?
Climate policies today are being implemented both at an industrial level and at an individual level, right? So the public is faced with choices about whether one should invest in an electric vehicle, whether one should switch from a gas boiler to a heat pump. These are really important questions faced by the UK public that requires information that is reliable, that is accurate, that is evidence-based. Only then can they, make an informed choice. Misinformation about such important topics can really confuse the public. It can polarize the public on such an important topic. For instance, we are already seeing, climate science become part of a culture war here in the UK. Net zero has become a pretty polarized term. It's really threefold. It can impact public opinion, public understanding, it can impact policy decisions, and it can also impact social cohesion by really causing distrust in institutions. Newspapers are actually failing to enforce their own editor's code of practice effectively. Clause 1 of the editor's code of practice says that the press must take care to not publish inaccurate or misleading information. And unfortunately, we've seen parts of the British press do exactly the opposite. This is particularly evident in the editorial letterheading sections of some of the left-righty newspapers like the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Sun. They have basically, they are circulating misinformation about UK's climate policies.
Pallavi shared some examples of how the press misreports stories relevant to climate change, including one in the Daily Mail, which falsely claimed a report found potholes were mainly caused by electric vehicles.
In reality, the report neither discussed nor mentioned electric vehicles anywhere. In fact, the report blamed the problem of pothole crisis to extreme weather events, something that's a direct consequence of the climate, rising traffic levels, as well as the impact of heavier vehicles. But it did not mention electric vehicles anywhere. So in a sense, the Daily Mail made up or fabricated this claim, you could say. Parts of the British press, including editorial sections in the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, have often told their readers that there is a high cost attached to this net zero policy. Except almost always they fail to mention that the cost of inaction, which is the cost of not taking any action towards climate change, far outweighs the cost of transitioning to net zero. And really trying to create this sense of, it's not urgent, climate action is not urgent, and it's a classic, in fact, climate delayism narrative that we're seeing in the press.
And in your view, what are the reasons for these low standards of reporting and this climate misinformation that we're seeing?
All these newspapers that I've mentioned, they are members of IPSO. In our experience, IPSO is allowing newspapers to say whatever they want to, as long as it's expressed as an opinion.
IPSO's record on climate change is disappointing, to say the least. But that's not the only area where it seems to be dropping the ball. Looking into IPSO's record, I was amazed to see that in 10 years it has not investigated or fined a single newspaper. Does unethical press reporting ever put people directly in harm's way? I travelled to Leeds to meet with White Ribbon, a charity which campaigns on domestic violence and has concerns about the impact misogyny in the press is having on women's safety.
The way women are presented Often their appearance is described in a way that just isn't the same in terms of men. And I think if you look at images of men, images of women in the media and how they're chosen and the stories that go alongside those, the headlines are often salacious, they can be quite extreme, they're drawing people in terms of the way that they're meant to view somebody in a way that just is not the same way that they're bringing people into stories about men. There's a real issue with reporting of domestic violence. We call it victim blaming, but it's giving a reason that it's been provoked. We need to really make sure that there's accountability is put on the perpetrator and not on the victim.
So do you think the media puts women at risk with its reporting?
Yes, I absolutely do. Men who have committed domestic homicide have looked through media examples. Sometimes they've even had a file of stories. And it's reinforcing this, I'm doing this because I've been provoked.
The media reporting showed an overwhelming sympathy and concern for our father and a total lack of concern for Mum and Charlotte, who seemed to just be props in our father's story, right? They were just collateral damage to our father's poor mental health. But our father didn't have mental health issues in the traditional sense. What he had was an obsession with control. The media had framed things exactly how our father would always frame them.
So it creates a cultural problem that domestic abuse is normalised and that the person takes away the responsibility from the perpetrator. I think the one I'd like to really highlight is Emma Patterson, who is a head teacher at Epsom College, murdered by her husband. And even headlines there were saying things like, was living in the shadow of his high-achieving wife, the reason for her murder. We can never allow that kind of content to be sent. It's giving people the idea that there's an excuse for murder, and we really need to make sure that that's challenged.
The fact that domestic violence experts are concerned that unethical press behaviour is putting women at risk should be a wake-up call. But there are other ways that newspapers are putting people at risk of harm too. I reached out to Dr. Corinne Fowler, a historian from the University of Leicester, who faced a visceral attack on her reputation when the press misrepresented her work on a report on the legacy of colonialism in Britain.
At first it was reported quite straight, and then it became very quickly political. It was all about how myself and my team were politically biased academics and that we were ideologically motivated. When someone writes a newspaper article on you, about you, especially online, and they give you no right of reply and they misrepresent your work and the work of your colleagues, you get a barrage of hate mail, of threats each and every time. The below-the-line comments under newspaper articles were people saying that I should be burned, that I should be hanged, that I should kill myself, full of threats, sometimes thousands of them, and I didn't read them all.
Did you fear for your personal safety?
Absolutely. I was in contact with the police multiple times. I couldn't walk alone. So it had a major impact on me. You never know if somebody is serious about a threat or not, but when there's such a volume of threats, when you're getting hundreds of them, it's really, you only need one. I couldn't walk alone. The police were involved, and so it just went on and on and on.
My son read, without my knowledge, the below-the-line comments under a couple of hostile articles, and he read a lot of unregulated hate speech there. So he read that I should kill myself. He read all of that, and I still don't know to this day what effect that might have had on him. I think the press are really in danger of deterring women from public life. Because when everything is couched in gendered terms like that, and when a lot of the hate mail is really misogynist and sometimes even sexual and in a really violent way, it could easily put you off.
So Ipso says on its website that it does have capacity to regulate the comment sections of newspapers. In your case, did you see any action taking place?
There was absolutely no evidence of regulating the hate speech below the line of the articles about me. Absolutely none whatsoever.
Hearing these experts talk about climate change, discrimination and misogyny has really underlined how some reporting can mislead us and cause us harm in all kinds of different ways. I remember after the phone hacking scandal, we also heard lots of stories of people facing intrusion after some kind of tragedy or traumatic event. I wondered whether this kind of thing still went on. It turns out that after the Manchester Arena bombing, a report found that several families had faced intrusions, and yet Ipso had done nothing. There were depressing similarities between what happened then and what happened almost 20 years ago, after the 7/7 bombing in London. Paul Dadge was nearby when the bomb exploded in 2005, and was one of the first on the scene to help the survivors. He was pictured helping a woman behind a mask, in an image which appeared on most front pages. He has since campaigned for higher standards in the press. We met him by the memorial to the Manchester Arena attack.
So after that photo was taken, which is now known as the photo of the woman in the mask, what happened next?
It was all over the world. I've always said that I found the attack easier to deal with than the press the next day.
And then subsequently you found out that at the same time as this was happening, your phone had been hacked.
Yeah. Newsnight had broken that people involved in 7/7 may have had their phones hacked. So I made contact with a lawyer. The lawyer then went to the Met and obviously found information that my phone had been accessed. But importantly, the person who I was in the picture with hadn't ever spoken to the press. I'm of the opinion that they accessed my voicemails to try and see if we'd been in touch and to get the background to the story that I wasn't willing to give to them.
So we're obviously now in Manchester, near to the site of the 2017 Manchester Arena bombings. The Kerslake report was published in which it was outlined that a lot of the families of the victims had been through press intrusion, reasonably similar to what you yourself describe.
On May the 22nd, 2017, Martin was actually very sadly killed at the Ariana Grande concert at the MEN Arena in Manchester. Nikita, my youngest, opened the door thinking it's the postman, and a young female journalist said to her, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Do you want to tell me about your brother? What was he like?" Really, it should have been us as parents to tell our daughter her brother has died, not some random journalist.
We didn't know the facts, and yet they were telling the kids, "Oh yes, he is dead."
Yeah.
Can't do that. Yet they can come round, some junior reporter can knock on our door and say to our daughter, "Well, your brother's dead. Would you like to talk about it?"
I can't take that back. We can't make that unhappen. She should never have found out that way. I know that Nikita wasn't the only child who was told bad news by a journalist. There was a 14-year-old who was told at the door that her mother passed away.
Often when people die in newsworthy circumstances, press intrusion leaves a trail of further heartbreak and trauma in its wake.
The reality was that Claire was stalked and she was murdered. The very behaviour that the journalists were showing and the reporters that were showing was stalking, was the very thing that the perpetrator was doing.
One reporter actually asked me why I wouldn't speak to him. When I said it was because I was grieving for my daughter, he said, "Yes, but I need you to speak to me because grief sells newspapers." But that is one step too far. Why does the law in this country allow them to do it? Why do people who have suffered a tragedy not get some form of protection from that?
Any complaint to Ipso must be brought within a few months of the article being published, and can involve multiple rounds of detailed correspondence. This process deters bereaved complainants from coming forward, and Ipso won't investigate on its own initiative. As a result, there are dozens affected every year who have nowhere to turn.
Hearing those stories and hearing that, how does that make you feel?
frustration, because obviously my abuses were back in 2005 and here we are 12 years later, another terrorist attack, and the press yet again taking centre stage to then be in a position again where other people have suffered in that way is really incredibly frustrating and makes me very, very angry. But I've met many parents of people who lost loved ones during 7/7, and then you have the press abuse that comes to a fore. It's hard to deal with that.
And how does it make you feel knowing that what happened to Figan happened to her?
I feel genuinely, I feel in some way that I've let her down. Here's another family so far late, so many years later, having the same issues that we'd had, and those victims aren't being properly dealt with by the press regulator that's in place now. Nothing has changed. No fines. We're still in the same position with members of the public being abused.
Everyone I've spoken to has stressed that journalists are doing incredibly important work and that freedom of the press must be protected. But a lack of accountability means that these publishers, when it comes to what they say about ordinary people, have been able to act with a level of impunity. Time and time again, failures of regulation have been raised.
So what needs to change with the media?
Well, regulation is really important. There need to be rules and guidelines that people abide by.
If there was one thing that you could do, what would it be?
More robust regulatory standards, and that's across the board now.
Where we've got to now, post-Leveson, is that we have another sham regulator, which is controlled by and populated by the very newspapers whose work it's supposed to be judging. So in Leveson's famous phrase, they're still marking their own homework. And they're not to be trusted.
The statistics speak for themselves. In 2022, only 0.6% of complaints to Ipso, the complaints handler for the national press, were upheld. It takes almost 6 months for a complaint to be processed, and the body has still never investigated or fined any of its members. Fortunately, there are people providing an alternative. In 2014, the UK's first independent press regulator, Impress, was founded. Unlike Ipso, Impress is not controlled by the press. It serves the public, follows the recommendations in the Leveson report, and has also been endorsed by the National Union of Journalists. But while over 200 local and independent newspapers are in Impress, most of the national press are in Ipso.
Most of Fleet Street were never going to be regulated. They didn't like the very concept of regulation. They didn't like to be held accountable. They like to hold everybody else accountable, but they don't like to be held accountable themselves. So they set up not a regulator, but a complaints body called Ipso. But it isn't a regulator. It's a complaints handler. Why is it not a regulator? Because Fleet Street made sure it would not write its own regulations. The regulations of Ipso, which is called their editor's code, it's written by a group of editors. They decide the standards by which they will operate it. That's not regulation. So Impress was established as the only recognised press regulator. The one way to ensure public accountability is to have proper, open, transparent regulation. Independently run, independent of government, independently financed, independent of the newspaper industry. That's what Impress is there to do.
It really does make a difference to your community to have independent, well-funded local journalism that's investigative and is part of the community. I think that press regulation absolutely needs to be reformed. At the moment, the press is marking its own homework. Ipso regulates a lot of the mainstream papers. We are regulated by Impress. It's incredibly important because, we need to be held accountable in the same way that every newspaper needs to be held accountable. That accountability is, really core to our values. That transparency is really core to our values.
I think as an independent title, we've definitely benefited from
being regulated by Impress, from their support and guidance throughout, the process of starting a newsroom to launching a newsroom and to that now running it. We should all be invested in good quality journalism, whether we work in the industry or not, whether we're readers or, members of the public. And if that can be replicated across the UK, then we not only build credibility as individual titles, but we also build credibility as a profession.
Despite the fact that most traditional newspapers are persisting with Ipso, a new wave of publishers are emerging and have joined Impress. For this documentary, I have spoken to journalists, campaigners, climate experts, and advocates for marginalised communities. When newspapers use their power for good, they can make a really positive difference in society. But in all the conversations I've had, one message that has come through consistently is that too often they are abusing their power. I don't think those advocating for higher press standards are trying to curtail press freedom or limit what the press can do. They want to protect people from abuse and harm, ensure the public have access to the facts on issues that matter, and uphold our rights and the rule of law. There is a system of independent regulation already, which was recommended after the phone hacking scandal, and which exists in the form of Impress. Yet none of the big national newspapers will join it. Instead, many remain with Ipso, marking their own homework. The government must decide what to do next. For those pushing for press reform, the choice is clear. Side with the media magnates to preserve the status quo, or act now so that national newspapers are independently regulated.